So good afternoon. If I could interrupt your eating, or at least have you cock an ear in this direction. I'm Bill Schulz. I still am Bill Schulz, a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress, and we've arranged a modest little presentation to you here over lunch, and we will conclude no later than 1:15. I'm going to be joined here at the podium in just a few minutes by Joseph Zogby. Joe is Chief Counsel to the Senate Subcommittee on Human Rights and the Law, a subcommittee of the Judiciary Committee, and he is Chief Counsel to Senator Richard Durbin, who is the Assistant Majority Leader. I'm going to try to frame some of the issues that we've been hearing about all morning and bring some of these strands together for us, talking about a general context in which the United States is now functioning with regard to its human rights law. And then Joe is going to talk about some of the specific bills and issues that are before the Congress in the area of human rights, what the prospects for those are, what the various tensions and opportunities within the Senate are for human rights legislation. Now, I know that in this erudite crowd, many of you read The New Yorker, and if you do, you're familiar with the little fillers that appear at the bottom of the columns, and one of my favorites was this one. Important notice. If you are one of the hundreds of parachuting enthusiasts who bought our book, Skydiving Made Easy, please make the following correction. On page 8, line 7, the words state zip code should have read pull ripcord. Now, when I read this, naturally I conjured up an image of hundreds of people falling through the air desperately shouting their zip codes. But on another level, that notice reminds us that the consequences of even one little mistake can be catastrophic. We're here at Georgetown, and perhaps I should remark that my favorite saint is Saint Praxedes, who, as you may know, St. Praxedes' job was to wipe up the blood of the Christian martyrs after they lost their heads. And that indeed is part of what the next president is going to have to do as well, to clean up the mess, taking St. Praxedes as a patron or patroness. I doubt if I have to convince anyone here, and we've certainly heard about it all morning, that the U.S. has made an enormous number of mistakes over the last few years in the area of human rights, and not just passing ones. I should say that I'm from Massachusetts, and a Democratic state senator got on the radio there a few years ago and proclaimed in loud and fervent tones, the Republican octopus is spreading its testicles across the entire Commonwealth. The consequences have been far more dire for human rights. I think it's important to say something fundamental about the connection between human rights and the international community. We've been listening all morning to the ways in which the United States has in effect thumbed its nose at the international community while trying to retain its reputation as a champion of human rights. And the truth is that that's simply impossible. When the state of North Carolina, for example, banned video poker some years ago, one poker enthusiast complained to the New York Times, "It's like the state telling me I have no rights. It's pretty close to being communist." Many Americans, like that gentleman, take a very expansive view of rights claims. A spokesman for the American Legion, for example, upon being asked to explain the symbolism of the American flag, reflected the views of many Americans, I think, when he said, "It stands for the fact that this is a country where we have the right to do what we want." But of course, a moment's reflection reveals the error of such a broad interpretation. For the first 100 years or so of the American Republic, Americans understood their rights to be those delineated in the U.S. Constitution. But in 1882, when the United States ratified the First Geneva Convention, it signaled its recognition that rights carried a transnational dimension. And since then, and especially since 1948, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted with American support, the U.S. has been party, as we know, to a whole series of treaties and covenants and conventions affirming that human rights are by definition those that have garnered an international imprimatur. And in the absence of such international rights claims, they're bound to fail. The truth is that no video poker may be an inconvenience, but the right to play video poker has not yet been recognized at the level of international law, and therefore it is not a recognized right. And this means that any nation that would promote itself as a champion of human rights must ipso facto recognize the authority of the international community when it comes to human rights. It is as basic as that. But what has been far more problematic than that basic disparity has been the disparagement of the authority of that international community. And this actually started very early. In the year 2000, when Condoleezza Rice was the foreign policy advisor to candidate Bush, she wrote this sentence in Foreign Affairs magazine: "Foreign policy in our administration," she said, "will proceed from the firm ground of the national interest and not from the interests of an illusory international community." Illusory. So it's no wonder that the administration has taken the posture it has towards the international community. The international community is just some chimera of some damn liberal's imagination. So we've seen the consequences, and we've heard this morning some of the things that need to happen in order to begin to repair the United States' reputation. And certainly, of course, some kind of resolution to the Iraq War has to be at the top of that agenda. Playing the role of an honest broker between the Israelis and Palestinians is part of that agenda. We've heard over and over again this morning the importance of addressing our own human rights violations. It is certainly true, as one of the last panelists touched on, that the human rights cause has suffered enormously because it has come to be identified with the spread of American empire. And there are enough doubts and questions about the real meaning of human rights, its Western Enlightenment source and roots, from those in the developing country. Those questions and criticisms have existed for years. And therefore, to have the notion that human rights are in some sense covalent with the spread of American empire does the human rights cause enormous damage. So we have heard today about many of the steps that can be taken. I'm not going to review the ones that have been mentioned with regard to Guantanamo Bay and the war on terror and human rights treaties. There are even simpler things that can be done very quickly by a new president. A new president can suspend the penalties that the U.S. has leveraged against those countries that have refused to immunize U.S. troops from possible prosecution by the International Criminal Court. A very simple thing to do. The U.S. can simply send observers to the upcoming conference on the Rome Statutes of the International Criminal Court in order to kickstart the process of eventually considering re-signing and ratifying of that convention. There is a conference coming up to review the status of the statutes after an initial period of time. The U.S. doesn't have to be, it isn't a member, so of course it can't be a formal participant, but it can certainly send an observer. The U.S. can consider standing for election to the UN Human Rights Council, flawed though that council be. It can welcome one or more UN special rapporteurs who wish to investigate conditions of various kinds, racism in the criminal justice system, for example, here in this country. We generally have not been welcoming of such rapporteurs. The government can publish our own State of Human Rights in the United States reports, comparable to the reports that we publish about the conditions of human rights around the world. That is a relatively straightforward thing to do that would model self-reflection and self-criticism in a way that I think would be received quite warmly around the world. And we have to say that we could also support an international treaty on terrorism that both codifies countries' responsibilities to combat terrorism, defines terrorism, and describes appropriate mechanisms for fighting it. These are some of the things that we can do. In general terms, the truth is that human rights are not an all or nothing proposition. And there are significant challenges and changes that face the human rights movement. We're going to be discussing this afternoon one of them, that is the need to identify human rights with larger issues of human development beyond the traditional ones of civil and political rights as well. We've talked about the way of finding ways to promote democracy in more appropriate fora. Ambassador Shattuck mentioned the responsibility to protect, the remarkable decision by the United Nations in 2005 to set aside the notion of national sovereignty in cases of genocide and ethnic cleansing taking place within the borders of a member state, to set aside the traditional appeal that tyrants and thugs have always made to the doctrine of national sovereignty, to set that aside and to recognize the international community's responsibility to protect victims of genocide and ethnic cleansing, which of course is receiving its first test in Darfur and failing miserably, but nonetheless an important opportunity for the United States to clarify its own obligations in the face of that kind of terror going on. There are all sorts of things that the United States can do with regard to labor rights, in attempting to influence, for example, the World Trade Organization members to address workers' rights in global trade rules and ensure that all future trade agreements contain strong, enforceable labor rights and protections. We can direct resources to programs and policies that protect women's rights, setting aside some of the artificial barriers that have been established to those by this administration. So there are a wide variety of opportunities, and in fact, the truth is that I think no matter who is elected president, we will find ourselves in a somewhat more positive situation with regard to human rights than we have to this point. Well, let me just say in conclusion that in the last analysis, human rights emerge out of the common misery of humankind. We talk at the Center for American Progress a lot about the common good, but what is equally important in the face of human rights is the common misery that transcends gender or region or ethnicity. Human rights give voice to the deepest yearnings of the human spirit, yearnings for things like reconciliation between adversaries, or a better life for our children, or just a fair distribution of the earth's abundance. And because they speak to the common misery, they cannot be interpreted unilaterally or enforced by any one power. They require inherently, by their very being, they require collaboration. President Truman wrote in 1945, the year he helped found the United Nations, "We all have to recognize," he said, "no matter how great our strength, that we must deny ourselves the license to do as we please." And that's a pretty good summary of the limits that human rights set. In the midst of the genocide in Rwanda in 1994, a girls' school, a young girls' prep school, was attacked in the middle of the night by machete-wielding militiamen, and the teenagers were rousted from their beds and forced out into the central courtyard of the school. And then the militia commander demanded that they divide themselves, Hutu over here, Tutsi over there, so that only the Tutsi could be killed. But not a one of the girls moved. And for a second time, the militia commander demanded, Hutu over here, Tutsi over there, and for a second time, not a one of the girls moved. And finally, one little girl, naturally terrified, raised her hand timorously. And she said, "I'm sorry, sir. I'm sorry, but we cannot separate ourselves. We cannot separate ourselves, you see, because, sir, in this country we are not Hutu. In this school we are not Hutu. We are not Tutsi. In this school we're all just Rwandan, just little Rwandan girls." At which point every one of the girls was slaughtered. But what a legacy they leave. We are not Hutu. We are not Tutsi. We're all just little Rwandan girls. And that sentiment is the most fundamental reflection of the human rights ethos that I know. And the echoes of that young girl's voice bespeak a graciousness for which the world is desperate. And no matter who the next president is, I have a feeling the United States will come at least a bit closer to heeding that voice than we have in a very, very long time. Thank you. So that, I hope, sets a general context for you, perhaps bringing together some of the strands that we've heard this morning. And now I want to invite Joe to bring us down to earth and talk about some of the hard, tough, practical issues that face the U.S. Congress. And I should say that Joe's boss, Senator Durbin, along with Senator Leahy and a few others, have just been outstanding champions of human rights. And given that we know that the staff do most of the work, we can know that Joe has played a major part in that. Joe's on.
Well, it's great to be with all of you today. I want to say it's an honor to share the podium with Bill Schulz, a real pioneer in the human rights movement and someone for whom people in my generation have looked up to, and people in the human rights field today. We really stand on the shoulders of people like Bill Schulz, so thanks, Bill. I was asked to give an update about the state of human rights on Capitol Hill today. Kind of a bleak subject, and I think if you were expecting, sort of came to this speech this morning, expecting to hear a relatively bleak picture, you wouldn't be wrong. But I just experienced the birth of my second son last Thursday, and so I'm in kind of a hopeful mood, and so I want to try to put as hopeful of a picture forward to you about what's happening on Capitol Hill today. Obviously, there are lots of negative things we could say. Guantanamo is still open over 6 years after 9/11, not to mention whatever CIA black sites are out there that we still don't know about. The administration has an attorney general, the chief law enforcement in this country, who refuses to repudiate the practice of water torture, which for decades the United States has considered to be a war crime and has prosecuted as a war crime. The administration still engages in the practice of extraordinary rendition, literally kidnapping people off the street and taking them away. Some of whom have not been heard of, have not been heard from since then. But I want to suggest today that there are hopeful developments. Bill suggested one, which is that I'm a Democrat, and this is not a partisan event, but I think it is safe to say that of the three remaining presidential candidates today, they all have a radically different view of human rights issues than the current administration does. And so that's hopeful. Attorney General Mukasey was confirmed, but I will remind you that it was expected that he would be confirmed perhaps unanimously, if not certainly by an overwhelming bipartisan vote, until on the second day of his confirmation hearings, which had been up to that point uneventful, he was asked by my boss, Senator Durbin, about waterboarding. And he hemmed and hawed and ultimately refused to condemn waterboarding as torture, ultimately had the most votes against his confirmation as any attorney general in decades. And I think that says something hopeful about where we have been and where we're headed. And back in 2004, my boss, Senator Durbin, proposed an amendment, simple amendment, to affirm the fact that cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment are illegal under U.S. law, something that we had expected, we had understood rather to be the case for generations. And he stood alone, frankly, in 2004. In 2005, Senator John McCain joined him, and ultimately the McCain torture amendment passed the Senate by a 90-9 vote. The administration appended a signing statement to the McCain torture amendment, but it still represented progress. And the last reason that I'm hopeful the reason I want to talk to you about today really is the establishment last year when the Democrats took control of Congress of a new Human Rights and the Law Subcommittee. It's surprising, astonishing to say, but in the Senate's 219-year history, there has never before been a standing body of the Congress that was dedicated to human rights issues. And we've had champions, of course. Senator William Proxmire is one that's very well known by those on the Hill. The Genocide Convention was proposed in 1949, rather sent to the Congress in 1949 by President Harry Truman, languished there for decades because of the concern of some Southern senators about national sovereignty, which Bill Schulz referred to before. And in 1967, Bill Proxmire took up this fight. Remarkable. He gave a speech on the floor of the Senate every day for 19 years. Every day the Senate was in session for 19 years, over 3,000 speeches, urging the Senate to ratify the Genocide Convention. It finally happened in 1986. So there have been lonely voices like Bill Proxmire, but there's never before been an institution, a body dedicated to the cause of human rights in the Senate. It's a small subcommittee, a modest subcommittee. I don't want to overstate its importance, but it is a home for these issues in the Senate, which we haven't had before. And I think it's significant and worth noting that this home is in the Judiciary Committee, the committee that is responsible for American law. And a lot of people were surprised by that. They thought that the subcommittee would be in the Foreign Relations Committee. And I think it says something about the importance of human rights and the law, that it is in the Judiciary Committee. Without the law, without the ability to enforce human rights, they're nothing more than empty promises. And we have, in our year and a couple of months of existence now, focused on the law. We have focused on the need for justice for the victims of human rights abuses, and the need for accountability for the perpetrators of human rights abuses. As Simon Wiesenthal, the famous Nazi hunter, said, seek justice, not vengeance. And it is really the key, the linchpin to breaking that cycle of violence and impunity that you see so often in places like Rwanda and today in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And so that has been our focus. And our focus has been on the United States and American law and what we can do to fulfill the promise of human rights in the American justice system. There's a lot we can do, a lot we need to do. Raphael Lemkin, the architect of the Genocide Convention, a Holocaust survivor, said, you must build the law. And that's what we're trying to do in baby steps, but in the Judiciary Committee. It's amazing that until a few months ago, under U.S. law, you could commit a genocide outside of the United States if you were not an American and come to this country with impunity. There was a loophole in our genocide law. The first thing the Human Rights Subcommittee did last year was to pass something called the Genocide Accountability Act, which now makes it clear that under U.S. law, genocide committed anywhere in the world by anyone, whether a U.S. citizen or not, is a crime under U.S. law and can be prosecuted in U.S. courts. That's the concept, principle of extraterritorial jurisdiction that exists for egregious human rights abuses like genocide. And we're now focused on other areas where there are loopholes like this. Crimes against humanity, the use and recruitment of child soldiers, another example. We passed legislation to make that a crime under U.S. law late last year. It's now in the House of Representatives, and there's actually a hearing on it later this afternoon, and we're hopeful that it will pass the House relatively soon. We've also got to enforce the law. And it's amazing. We've done some oversight in this area. There's never been oversight over what is the U.S. government doing to enforce human rights law. There's been good work done by groups like Amnesty International over the years to point out the fact that the U.S. government is not doing enough to hold accountable human rights abusers who have found safe haven in the United States. We've discovered that over 1,000 war criminals are in this country right now, living here with impunity, and the U.S. government is not taking action against them. It's something that we need to shine a light on. We need to put pressure on the government to do more, and we've started to do that. And in fact, last year, the first indictment was brought under the torture statute statute was passed in 1994. Last year was the first indictment. And in fact, the first indictment for a serious human rights violation in U.S. history. Chucky Taylor, the son of former Liberian strongman Charles Taylor, and that's a positive development. But there needs to be a lot more of a piece. So that's been our focus legislatively, and I'm happy to answer questions about specific issues. But I do want to say that I think in a lot of ways the most important purpose of this subcommittee has been to give voice to those who have really borne the burden of the common misery that Bill Schulz spoke about before. And I just want to leave you with the words of Ishmael Bea, who was a former child soldier, wrote a best-selling memoir about his experiences in Sierra Leone. And it's a remarkable book if you have a chance to read it. He was a witness at our hearing on child soldiers last year, and here's what he told the subcommittee. When you go home tonight to your children, your cousins, and your grandchildren, and watch them carrying out their various childhood activities, I want you to remember that at that same moment, there are countless children elsewhere who are being killed, injured, exposed to extreme violence, and forced to serve in armed groups, including girls who are raped. As you watch your loved ones, those children you adore most, ask yourselves whether you would want these kinds of suffering for them. If you don't, then you must stop this from happening to other children around the world whose lives and humanity are as important and of the same value as all children everywhere. The voices of people like Ishmael Bea have not been heard on Capitol Hill, and we're starting, I think, to give voice to them, and that's a reason that I'm hopeful today, and I hope we'll be able to do more in coming years. Thanks.
So if you have any questions for Joe, we're more than happy to take those. Or did we answer? We solved all the problems of the world.
Could you tell us who's on the subcommittee?
Sure. Senator Durbin, Dick Durbin, a Democrat from Illinois, is my boss. He's the chairman of the subcommittee. Tom Coburn, who's a Republican from Oklahoma, is the ranking member. And actually, one of the very interesting things about the subcommittee has been the bipartisanship. Senator Durbin, one of the most progressive liberal members of the Senate, Tom Coburn, one of the most conservative members of the Senate, and they have formed this partnership. There are some issues, frankly, where even in the human rights field, where they don't agree. But on issues of accountability for genocide, crimes against humanity, child soldiers, et cetera, they have found common ground. And this legislation that I mentioned, genocide accountability, for example, was bipartisan, passed the Senate by unanimous consent, and so it's one of the hopeful things. Other members of the subcommittee, Joe Biden from Delaware, do the Democrats first. Joe Biden, Russ Feingold, Sheldon Whitehouse from Rhode Island, and Ben Cardin from Maryland. On the Republican side, I'm not going to pull a Rudy Giuliani here. That's my wife. We have a 4-year-old son, a 4-day-old son, and a 3-year-old son. So I'm on leave from paternal leave for a couple hours here. The Republicans are Tom Coburn, John Kyle from Arizona, Lindsey Graham from South Carolina, and John Cornyn from Texas.
Anything else?
Yes. Sort of a broad question to either one of you. How do you think you can get average people to care more about these issues and then put more pressure on their elected governmental representatives? I think a lot of the students who are here and a lot of people in this room do care about these issues, but among the broader public, what are the ways that we could really get people to care?
Well, Rachel, I wrote a whole book about that called In Our Own Best Interest, How Defending Human Rights Benefits Us All. And I think, there are essentially two ways that anybody comes to care about human rights. Most people come to care about human rights on an emotional level because they hear of a story. They hear of someone like Bey and the story that he is able to tell. and that emotionally moves them and touches them. And that's very important, but it's not enough to sustain a long-term grassroots commitment to human rights. The only thing that will do that is a recognition also of the complementarity of human rights and our national interest in a whole series of ways. And I, of course, don't have time to go through them today, but we know that human rights are implicated when it comes to the environment, to trade and economic health of this country. We know that that health itself, that diseases transcend borders, and diseases are often caused when governments do not allow the truth about, as we saw in the SARS epidemic, do not allow the truth about various kinds of vectors and how they are carrying diseases to be known by the public. So there are a whole variety of very profound ways in which the national interest is implicated by human rights. And I think that we need to begin to articulate that more readily, to complement the powerful emotional, moral arguments for human rights with these very pragmatic arguments from realpolitik. And I think we will find that to the extent to which we do that, we can actually be more creative than Ambassador Sasser, for example, thinks with regard to China in recognizing that for China itself, many of its own national interests having to do with pollution, for God's sake, and any number of other things, including its reputation, have a very strong connection to human rights. That's at least some of the way. Joe, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess just one other thing I'll mention, just sort of from where I sit, which is the importance of institutionalization. I mean, having official, and the subcommittee is a good example, official bodies whose role it is to represent those interests is one important thing. I think, although I'll say that's one step of the battle, but avoiding marginalization is probably another step. I mean, the establishment of the Bureau of Democracy, Rights, and Labor in the State Department was a very important step and has meant a lot. But I used to work at the State Department, and I'll tell you that DRL was marginalized at the State Department, and I worked at the Justice Department after that, and the Civil Rights Division where I worked was also marginalized a lot of times in the policy debate. So I would say, institutionalization and mainstreaming from the governmental perspective is a really important thing.
And I might say, Joe, that for those of you who are government wonks, there is a great chapter in the book that's for sale over there by Eric Schwartz, who used to be in the National Security Council, about how to demarginalize those types of human rights related entities within the government. So those of you who just love that kind of thing, take a look at that chapter. Yes?
Hi. The morning sessions have my head spinning with words like general persuasion and focus on human rights rather than economic and security. So with the next administration assuming that that's an important thing to that next administration, human rights, would general persuasion be sort of a code word for veiled threats? And I say this because in countries which there was a talk of a common language instead of our language, but there are not necessarily common belief systems in other countries, or at least in the power structures of some other countries, and so the assumption that if we could just all sit down together, does that actually, how do you envision doing that, and is it veiled threats while not embarrassing them in public, or?
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't think general persuasion is a code word for veiled threats. I think it's a code word for moving on to coffee after dinner. The head of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce in Hong Kong a good many years ago, a friend of mine, I had a drink with him in Hong Kong, and we were talking about how business, both American and European and Japanese business, could potentially have an impact on human rights. And he said, oh, yes, it's true. He said, you may be unhappy with how we in the U.S. Chamber discuss human rights with the Chinese, but we do have substantive conversations. He said, the Europeans and the Japanese, their approach to dialogue is to wave goodbye and on their way out of the room shout, human rights, human rights. And I think far too often that's how that has been effectuated. I actually think that we establish certain universally acceptable standards through the World Trade Organization and in various different kinds of economic relations, the rules of the game, the rules to play by. And I think there are ways to at least begin to nudge these cultures along in certain respects. And I think there are actually far more creative vehicles for doing that, some of which were referred to the panels, but others of which were not. So, I don't think that threats usually do much good because the U.S. is never prepared to follow through, and understandably in most cases, because as Secretary Albright said, human rights are not the be-all and end-all of U.S. interests or policies. We're not going to bomb North Korea or China or anyone because they're violating human rights. So to the extent to which we do establish norms and threats, they have to be credible ones, and they have to be ones that we're really prepared to carry out. And since we haven't been prepared even to carry them out against Sudan, it's highly unlikely that those kind of things work. Now, some very targeted kinds of sanctions definitely do work under right circumstances. Certainly multilateral sanctions that others agree to, those certainly work. But we have to be far more clever, I think, than we have been. Do you want to add to that?
No, that's okay.
Maybe a last comment, question?
When one talks about genocide, one of course comes back to the question of Armenia and Turkey.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Is there really any benefit to dealing with that now as opposed to the current issues that face us around the world?
Now, there's a good one for Joe to answer. So.
Well, that is obviously a huge hot potato on the Hill. Very challenging political issue. Senator Durbin, my boss, happens to feel very strongly that it is important. And he was the lead sponsor in the Senate. He is the lead sponsor in the Senate of the resolution characterizing what happened in Armenia as a genocide. It sounds like you're very familiar with the path of this resolution last year. It ultimately was pulled back because of concern about the reaction of Turkey, one of our close allies in the war on Iraq. I will say, I mean, my boss's perspective is that it is important moving forward that we be honest with ourselves, because if you're not honest about your history, you don't learn the lessons of history, then you're not likely to take constructive action in the future. And by the way, he links Darfur and Armenia. And this is the first ongoing genocide that we've labeled as such, and yet there are many things we could be doing that we're not doing. And so, I think that's his perspective, that it is a worthwhile fight, and that we have to be honest about it. Otherwise, how can we have any confidence that we'll be honest in the future about other genocides?
Okay, many thanks to Joe Zogby for joining us. Appreciate that. And we'll see you back in the auditorium at 1:30.